Back in the early days of personal computers, the user interface was based entirely on text. There were no real graphics and you didn't have a mouse, so everything was done by reading words off the screen and typing in commands on your keyboard to tell the computer what to do. Even the state-of-the-art computer games of the era, like Zork, were entirely text-based. The game would describe what was around you in black and white text, and then you'd type in the action you'd like to take. For example, if it told you there was a leaflet in a mailbox, you'd type, read leaflet. Or you'd type east to move east. It was amazing, believe it or not. And after a long day of school, walking uphill in the snow both ways of course, I couldn't wait to get home and play games like Zork. In general, beginning programmers start out creating text-based programs too. You use some kind of a print or write statement to display some output, you collect some keyboard input and store that in a variable, and then you do whatever you need to do before displaying the result using text. We start that way because it's really easy to get up and running quickly, and then you're just sort of stuck with those text or console-based programs until your professor gets off his butt and shows you another way. So just like early PC pioneers, we start with text-based stuff until something better comes along. And that something better that comes along is a graphical user interface, which we call a GUI, but really everybody just calls it a GUI. Now, this particular GUI is from a computer called the Alto, and it was a very early prototype of what a GUI could look like. It wasn't really a personal computer, it was more of a research project. I think they determined that if they were really to build it and sell it, it would cost something like $10,000. So it didn't have any commercial impact directly, but it does have a huge place in history. Steve Jobs took a team of Apple employees to see a demonstration of the Alto, and what he saw inspired them in 1984 to release the Macintosh, which is the first kind of widespread personal computer that relied primarily on a GUI for its user interaction. And this kind of GUI is based on the idea of point and click. Your monitor displays images instead of text, and if you want to interact with it, you use your mouse to click on it. The components of the GUI on your screen that you click on and interact with are called widgets or controls. Now, if you're under the age of 50, you've been using these widgets your entire life because they're things like labels for displaying text, buttons to click on, text boxes if you need to type something in, and drop-down lists, which have the fancy name combo boxes. And there are, of course, lots of other widgets or controls as well, but you see these in many of the programs and websites that you use on a regular basis. There are some really fundamental differences between how a program with a GUI executes compared to a program with a text interface. A text-based program runs in a specific order that's determined by the programmer, and when it needs something from the user, it stops and sits there. The user can't move on until they give the program what it's asking for. A GUI program, on the other hand, can make the interface available and let the user interact however they want. Basically, it lets the user dictate the flow of the program by sitting and waiting patiently for us to use a widget. When the user does interact with a widget, it runs a chunk of code related to that interaction. If the user clicks on the Save button, it runs a function or method to save the work. We call this event-driven programming, and the idea is that you're going to write your code in what we call event handlers. Having our program execute using event handlers that respond to the user gives us a lot of flexibility and lets us do things that you just can't do with a text-based program. So why do we wait until now to learn about GUIs? We should have been doing this all along, right? The truth is, creating a GUI can actually get pretty complicated. It's not that difficult once you get the hang of it, but it's one more thing at the beginning that novices just aren't ready for, and we don't want to make them frustrated and confused just trying to get something simple to display. It's easier to start with simple output and input statements. Still, creating all these text-based programs all this time has probably gotten pretty old, and you might be a little frustrated with it. And as an instructor, I want to cash in on a couple of habits I've been trying to instill in my students up to this point. For example, I keep telling you not to put output statements in your functions or methods, but to pass data around using arguments and return statements. And to do your calculations and save them to variables instead of just sticking them in your output statement. And that's been pretty annoying. But when you include output in your code that does the work, and when you do math inside of your print or write statements, you're tying your code to the user interface. If you want to use that code in a GUI program or a web app, you got problems. All those output statements won't work anymore. If we separate or decouple our code from the user interface, it ensures that code is reusable in any kind of user interface. I use the analogy of a restaurant since lots of students have done that kind of work. In food service, you refer to the front of house and the back of house. The front of house people, like servers and hosts, interact with the customers and then pass that information off to the back of house where the cooking is done. It's then given back to the server to deliver to the customer. The customer doesn't need to see what goes on back there. A GUI is front of house and does the work of interacting with the user and calling the event handlers, which are the back of house functions needed to get results back to the user. So, you've paid your dues and written a bunch of boring text-based programs like your professor told you to do. Now it's time to start creating fancy graphical user interfaces for the rest of the boring programs your instructor makes you do from here on out.